I have selected as my mission in life getting one fundamental thing done. The President of the United States tells a basic truth about our world. There's either extraterrestrials here or there aren't. And if there are, the government needs to acknowledge that. And that is the disclosure event. That is the goal of this movement.
Hey friends, thanks so much for joining us. I'm extremely excited to have on the line someone who's going to help us walk through a very deep, dark rabbit hole. You know, we talk a lot about the $8.5 trillion missing from the Pentagon. Joseph P. Farrell and Catherine Austin Fitts have specifically cited and spoken about, quantifiably, the breakaway civilization. And we wonder what's going on in the deep state with the black budget projects. Famously, Ben Rich, the former head of Lockheed Skunk Works, once said, "We have the technology to take ET home. Anything you can imagine, we already know how to do."
So it started off with very polite questioning, and it turned to more direct questioning. Like, you mentioned this ability to take ET home. Can you tell us more about that? And so he basically said that there's an error in the equations, and it was plural. We've discovered what it is, and we now have the technology to travel to the stars and take ET home. I think is what he actually said.
So on the line, I have Steve Basset. He's the executive director of Paradigm Research Group, which was founded in 1996 to end the government-imposed embargo on the truth behind the so-called UFO phenomenon. Now, before we begin, guys, I understand that this topic is very polarizing. Some people believe it's an alien deception. Some people believe there's no such thing. Some people believe all the UFOs people see are of terrestrial origin, connected back to the deep state. We're going to explore all of these topics right now. Mr. Bassett, thanks for joining us.
It's good to be with you, Sean.
I want to thank our mutual friend, Robert Burke, for getting us in touch with each other. And, I just wanted to mention to folks, too, guys, the reason I wanted to explore this issue is because we don't know what's going on. We don't know what happened to $8.5 trillion, which the Pentagon openly admits it cannot account for. That's plenty of money for black projects. That's plenty of money for advanced technology and research that would benefit a breakaway civilization and not benefit humanity at large. And guys, my recent video, 2016 X-Files Exposed, Elite's Genocidal Plan from Global Banking Collapse to Alien Deception, has more than 190,000 views. So clearly, this is a topic very important to folks. And Mr. Bassett, I'm just really glad to have you on so that we can explore this topic in detail. Can you tell people a little bit about your mission at Paradigm Research Group?
It's fairly straightforward. Paradigm Research Group was founded for one purpose only, and that is to resolve the extraterrestrial presence issue by political means. And the reason for that is that this is an unusual situation where the fundamental subject matter has been tampered with or corrupted by the state. This does happen, and it's happened in history before, but probably nothing quite like it in the modern era. So the situation by 96 was, at least for me, clear that more than enough science had been done to confirm the extraterrestrial presence. However, the government stated there was no extraterrestrial presence. Therefore, the science must be invalid. So there was no scientific solution. A policy had to be changed. And it's a perfect analogy. There are people that have known for 50 years that there's an island called Cuba south of Florida. But they can't go there. They do, they can go to jail. They can suffer harsh penalties. Recently, that embargo has been lifted, mostly, and now they can't go there. It's the same thing with the ET issue. It wasn't about whether it was true or not. It was about whether you were allowed to go there or not. Mm-hmm. And so ending the truth embargo meant ending a government policy. That meant a political solution. And that had not been properly engaged. And so that's the path I took. I didn't think it would take 20 years. To do it, frankly, but it did. But we're getting close to the end of this process.
Well, one thing I want to point out for folks, and I was watching your disclosure of extraterrestrial presence, a video presentation you did up in Canada, and in that you say, and I quote, "If government chooses to have a war, it will send your kids to war to die. So if governments don't matter, how come they do things like this and start wars? Because they do matter. And so you don't run from them, you engage them. You are called to action." And you say, "I'm an activist, my job is action, and my goal is to change government policy, end quote. I like that a lot because it's taking the power back. We know that the deep state, right, has stolen the power from the people. The Constitution doesn't seem to matter anymore. The Bill of Rights is being eroded. The X-Files show itself says through the Patriot Act, through the Military Commissions Act, they want to roll out this police state and ultimately use the police state to enslave America.
To create problem, reaction, solution scenarios to distract, enrage, and enslave American citizens at home. With tools like the Patriot Act and the National Defense Authorization Act, which abridge the Constitution in the name of national security.
I think we're seeing truth spill out all over the place now. Unfortunately, though, as I pointed out in that video, Mr. Bassett, I think the common man, the sheeple people, are going to interpret that show and some of the truth as fiction, when I think a lot of it is fact. What's your take on any of that? Were you able to watch that clip?
I've watched the clip. And, of course, the clip you're referring to is the recent X-Files show. Now we're getting into some really complicated territory. Let me see if I can frame it for your listeners in a way that makes sense. We're dealing with two kinds of disclosure here. Capital D and small d. Small d disclosure is the revealing of information, the transference of information, usually from an authoritative platform to a populist platform. That's usually the way it's looked at. And that's been going on. It's been going on for quite a while. And it will continue to go on for quite a while into the future. Then there's capital D disclosure. That is the focus of the advocacy work. And it's quite simple. It's not complicated. But yet it's confusing to people. And I get that, right? They hear about it for the first time. Right? Small d, big D, what are you talking about? Capital D disclosure is an event. It is and is nothing else but the formal acknowledgement of the extraterrestrial presence by the heads of state of world governments, starting with a single country, most likely, and most likely the United States. I guess you could call it a declaration of disclosure, just like governments will have declarations of war, which is a formal acknowledgement that we're now at war with somebody, which then triggers a whole lot of things. Declaration of disclosure or disclosure will also trigger a great deal. So that's capital D disclosure. That's really easy. That's the goal of the advocacy movement. That's the goal of PRG. It is the fundamental goal. Now there are others, but they are all subordinate to that. Then there's small d disclosure. And that's when things get really complicated. Let's state the obvious, that over the last 68 years, going back to Roswell, which I kind of use as a significant demarcation, it is the beginning, purely arbitrarily, I guess not totally arbitrarily, but it is what I use as the beginning of the modern era of the UFO, which lasted from 47 to 91. And in 92, the era of exopolitics began. Prior to 47, we'll call it the pre-modern era of the UFO, which goes back as far as you want to go, and is also being examined. And information is coming out about that. Again, small d disclosure. But the modern era is far more complicated and yet far richer in information. And a great deal has been done to try to understand this history. So let's agree there is a history, a fundamental truth about everything that has happened within the government, within the action of the ETs, the interaction with the general public by ETs, everything you want to mention, plus everything else outside of the ET realm, either directly or indirectly or not even connected at all, whether it be the role of the secret empires, as I like to call them, the rise of mass surveillance states, and everything else going on in the world. The real truthful history. There is a truthful history. Now, the fact of the matter is that one thing we've learned is that when it comes to history, we only really get a small percentage. Too much has happened. No way you can keep track of it all. Worse, the information is usually polluted. Classic phrase, history is written by the victors. And so the history we do know is fundamentally flawed. That is a given. That's not going to change. So the first thing people need to understand is they try to deal with history in this extraordinary time when we have more access to information than any humans have ever had. Not only information of a local nature, but virtually a global nature. We also have more access to false information than at any time in history.
Right.
In other words, we have experimented with the internet, which is what it is. It's an experiment. It arrived on our doorstep without a manual of operations. And we've just been trying to figure it out. It's roughly been going on since the early 90s, so we'll call it a 20-year deal. We're making some progress, but those who think, oh, I got it down, they are naive. So it is a very messy, complicated time, right, for truth. Now, that's important because one of the things that history has taught us is that there are no guarantees of outcomes. There are no utopias. And that, by and large, we do the best we can with the primary goal of survival. Of late, we've strived for other things beyond just survival. So that's a given, right? We're doing the best we can. But unfortunately, oftentimes that's not enough. But whatever transpires, history has clearly shown that truth provides the superior outcomes, though no guarantee of success. Mm-hmm. So when governments, like people, rely too much on lying, nations fall. When people rely too much on lying, relationships fail. So what are we to do? No easy answers there.
Right.
We get by and large, trying to tell the truth in those things which are useful and lying when we need to. People understand that. Where it gets to be a problem is governments act the same way, which they do. And that's a problem because when an individual selectively lies in order to function in this world, the consequences are usually modest and maybe even not ultimately too damaging. But when governments lie, particularly on an institutional basis, the consequences can be catastrophic. And so humans have a dilemma. Something that they can do in their own life, which they're accustomed to on a one individual basis, really cannot happen in the commons. And yet, naturally, they're inclined to let it happen because, hey, I do it, why can't the government do it? Big problem. Wasn't so much of a problem prior to 45, but it becomes a problem when we invent the atomic bomb.
Right.
And so from 45 to the present, we have several things happening. One, the ability to get information is exponentially increased. The destruction of our technology is exponentially increased. The ability to misinform, disinform, surveil, undermine, in other words, the entire intelligence world has exponentially increased. And us poor souls are trying to manage our social contract, as every other country and every other group of citizens are doing, within a matrix which is probably unprecedented in history and well beyond our pay grade.
Well, let me ask
you something. It's a mess.
It is a mess.
All
Let
right.
me ask you something. You've inspired a thought here because you talked about history and how difficult it is for any one of us to understand the full scope of human history in just one lifetime. I equate it to the bankers, right? We're constantly told that the Forbes top richest people list include Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Carlos Slim. They'll never mention the Rothschild banking dynasty that goes back generations. They won't mention the Rockefeller banking dynasty that goes back generations. It reminds me of a Steve Martin joke that I heard years ago that made me laugh, and it always makes me laugh. And it's this: what if you taught your child wrong words on purpose? So on the first day of kindergarten, when your child has to go to the bathroom, she raises her hand, and the teacher calls on her and says, "May I go to the banana patch, please?" We don't know history. What we do know is certain things about history, though, we do know are fact, like Operation Paperclip and all of the Nazi scientists that were brought here and put to work for NASA. We know that the Denver airport is wrapped in riddles and mystery. We know the runways, when you look from above, are laid out in a swastika design. We know of the murals that suggest a terrible future for humanity that once were in that airport and have since been removed. We know about the deep state, Cheyenne Mountain, the secret government. But just to support what you're saying, it's hard for us to know the true history because it's being hidden from us. And I guess as I throw it back to you, I just want to ask you about NASA in general, knowing about Operation Paperclip as historical fact, knowing about Nazis being imported here and put to work at NASA. Can we believe a word NASA says as we look at history? Do we know what they've been up to? Do we know what's really going on? Do they have secret technologies they're not sharing with us?
Well, again, you see the dilemma? You've thrown a few points out there, and yet there are a million more behind that. And so we wake up every morning with the simple truth that we can only know a tiny, tiny fraction of what is going on in the world. And what's extraordinary is we even care, because there was a time when people didn't care at all. They couldn't know, didn't care. But we have gotten to that point where, yeah, it would be nice to know these things. But let me give you a better analogy that I think maybe describes the situation more clearly. Imagine if the truth was a huge jigsaw puzzle. Big box, got 20,000 pieces in it. And it's the truth, the absolute truth. It is a picture of the world as it is. And you come into this world and you get an education and you're handed that box, and the idea is to put the pieces together. And if you put the pieces together on this huge table will be the truth about the world that you live in. And so you set about. All good, wonderful thing. Except there's a problem. It turns out that the government that you're living under, has made a decision to interfere with this truth process. It's a political decision being made for political purposes to serve almost certainly the state, almost never the citizens. So what has the government done? Well, first of all, it's taken a whole bunch of those pieces out and thrown them away. They're missing. Well, that's a problem. But it gets worse. They've grabbed a bunch of pieces from another box, another puzzle, and thrown them in to your box, the one that's going to give you the truth of the world. And now, right, you have to put this thing together with the idea or hoping that what you're going to have is a picture of the truth. That is a almost impossible situation. It's extremely effective, and it serves the state, and that is what we are facing. Now, a lot of people will say, well, why? All right, so what? The government does this, it serves the government, but, the trains run, the water works, my toilet flushes, I can live a life, I can have a kid, whatever. What's the big deal? It's a good point. An awful lot of people have taken that position. There is in people an understanding, which I call an almost fundamental law of the universe. One some people might call higher law or natural law. And I think it is a survival thing, in that we have a genetic disposition to truth. We know genetically that it is the superior way to go, that it produces the best outcomes. It produces the most survivability, and that is on a special basis. In other words, as a species, your chance of surviving. We know that in an individual basis, sometimes telling the truth gets you killed. But genetically, we have disposition to the truth. And so when we are denied that, it makes us uncomfortable. All right. With that as the backdrop, circa 2016, people are trying to understand what's going on in the world around them. And the reason that they're highly motivated to do that is the circumstances right now have become sufficiently dire that their well-being is unquestionably at risk. And if it wasn't for the internet and a lot of other media, they wouldn't know that. But they do. That's a problem. All right? They understand the environment is in under serious pressure. They understand the social contracts are breaking down. They understand the kind of weapon technology that we've developed. They understand the serious overpopulation problem. And they see before them a an ocean of pain coming their way. And they're right. And that's very upsetting. I don't blame them. But what in the hell do you do about that when you are able to see things in a somewhat macroscopic way, but yet the issues involved in dealing with it are massive and complex? That's brutal. And then the internet gets dropped into this. So now we have this ability not only to communicate with everybody on the planet, but tell lies at unprecedented levels and have those lies dispersed at unprecedented speed. The internet is, of course, the most powerful connectivity technology of all time. It's the most powerful information transfer technology of all time. It's also the greatest disinformation technology of all time. And so, like the atomic bomb, it has enormous power, but if used incorrectly, unbelievably destructive.
Right.
All right. So this is the arena that this activist movement is operating. It is operating in an information matrix that has been tremendously undermined, polluted, and corrupted by the very government that is serving the activists and the people seeking the truth on this. It is operating in a time when the amount of misinformation is not only voluminous, but is spread far and wide. And it's operating in a situation where the very government itself actually denies the existence of the issue that is being sought to be resolved.
Well, and that's
this is roughly the equivalent of the government not simply embargoing Cuba, but undergoing a massive indoctrination program to convince enough of the American people that there is no island there at all, successfully enough that anybody that brings it up is viewed with skepticism and ridicule and derision, like you're one of those people that think there's a Cuba. What are you, a cubist? Right? Imagine that. That is the situation that we're dealing with. There are a million individual things that you could focus on, right? And spend your entire life. Don't have that luxury, don't have that time. I'm dealing in broader strokes in a more macroscopic way. Right, my job is not to resolve the 10 million issues that are quote at hand and unresolved, but rather to seek a particular outcome that could have a beneficial effect. So, in that sense, I am not a good talk show guy, and in terms of being a talk show host, right, or running one. But I'm a good activist.
Right, where I think you and I definitely find common ground is in this discussion of a breakaway civilization, and I want to talk about that with you. And I would really like your expertise in helping us decipher two specific areas of that X-Files show in the video that I did. I want to ask you two specific things about that. But just getting back to this breakaway civilization, you talk about the fact that humanity understands the peril that we currently find ourselves in. And certainly, my listeners and our readers at SGT Report very much understand that we're in a lot of trouble. And I've often said, Stephen, that the planet could be an Eden if the planet were controlled by benevolent dictators as opposed to the malevolent dictators which are in control of planet Earth. And they're turning it into a hellhole. And in fact, not to go too far down the rabbit hole or off on a different track, but as it relates to this breakaway civilization, we know that there's very mysterious things going on at CERN. We know that there's $8.5 trillion missing from the Pentagon. What is your take on the breakaway civilization? Do you believe there is one?
Breakaway civilization is the term that Richard Dolan has put forward, and I've listened to many of his lectures, and he describes it. Some people refer to the shadow government. Some people refer to the secret government. I have a different take. Richard and I are not in agreement on the framework of this, which he has described in his way. I call it the secret empire, and there are distinctions with differences there. The secret empire for me, and what I refer to, is the sum total of the entire covert aspects of a social contract, which includes all of the intelligence agencies, all of the classified people, all of the classified programs, all of the classified documents, all the hidden classified facilities, underground or otherwise, all of it. Right? And the U.S. has created the largest version of that in history. Other countries have their own versions, their own little secret empires. And one, I guess, could put them all together and call it a confederate of secret empires. This is the way I view it. I don't see it as a breakaway civilization. I don't see it as shadow government. I don't believe the secret empire in the United States is running the country. They are running their empire, which has separated some away from, I guess, again, not breakaway civilization, but has separated a good deal of what it does away from the political oversight, which is obviously not a good thing. So that's the way I think about it, right? And because it's secret, right away we got a problem, don't we? Mm-hmm. How do you make assertive, factual statements about something which is secret? You really can't. Right? So that right away is a problem. But it's worse than this. First and foremost, anyone who is trying to address the issues in the world today, they have that extra time. They don't have 3 kids and a spouse, a job, and they're living week to week, and they have this extra time, and they're really focusing on and trying to figure out all these things. The first thing they need to know, and I'm just going to focus on the ET issue, I'm just focus on that one area, right? At least half of everything out there, and that certainly includes the internet, on the ET issue, is false. At least half. And it could be higher. It could be 60, 65, maybe even 70% false. Now, it may be deliberately false, okay? Meaning it's disinformation inserted by most likely the government. It could be also deliberately false as a hoax, because humans love to hoax. It's what we do. And there's a certain amount of that. Hoaxing, fun, screwing around, hacking, whatever you want to call it. And it could just be wrong, meaning people have made a dutiful effort to try to understand something. They've written it up, they put it on the net, or they wrote a book, but it's wrong. So I get up every day understanding that. I encourage other people to think the same way. When I flip this laptop open and I crank it up, I go on knowing that with respect to the ET issue, 50, 60, 70% of everything there is wrong, for whatever the reason. So that means that I've got to really be strategic and discretionary in terms of how I interact with and deal with information. Mm-hmm. Now, there are other fields where it's not as bad. I mean, I could go to websites that deal with high-level math or quantum mechanics, high-level sites. And the amount of information that's wrong on those sites, the percentage would be far lower. Nobody's surprised at that. So depending upon where you are, the percentage of false information or wrong information goes up or it goes down, right? And probably the number one reason that one needs to get educated now in the modern era is not really to get rich. The number one reason to get educated is to learn how to think, so that in the age of information, which is what we have now, which will be pretty much the fundamental core of everything pretty soon, you have got to have enough mental ability to be able to discern what's true and what's false, or at least assign probabilities to information. And if you can't do that, then you're basically walking through a minefield without any idea where the mines are, and the chances are pretty good you're going to get blown up one way or another. We don't teach that way. That's not what our schools do now. But we'll figure it out pretty soon, because the cost of not doing that will be rather severe.
Well, yeah, and that's the number one problem with our society, is that most people don't have the ability to do critical thinking anymore. We talk about that a lot in our interviews. The American people in general have, most of them anyway, the majority of the American people have lost their ability to apply critical thinking to anything, from politics to banking to the public schools, Common Core, infiltration of a communist agenda here in this nation. People are easily deceived. And so in the time that we have together, please just bear with me. I just want to ask you about a few specific things so that you can help us discern truth from reality as you see it.
I'll be very candid, you can be sure.
Okay. Couple of names I'm going to throw out. I'm passing judgment on neither of these people, nor do I have any preconceived notions of what they're saying is true. But I want to name 2 people and get your thoughts on this as it pertains to off-planet terrestrial UFOs. Okay,
Right.
the first person is Gary McKinnon, who is the famous British hacker, certainly a low-level hacker living in his mom's house, who
Yeah.
is said to have hacked into, I think, NASA and Pentagon files, computer systems, and was then made a target for having done so. But he said this, and I quote, "I found a list of officers' names under the heading non-terrestrial officers. It doesn't mean little green men. What I think it means is non-Earth based. I found a list of fleet-to-fleet transfers and a list of ship names. I looked them up. They weren't U.S. Navy ships. What I saw made me believe they have some kind of spaceship off-planet," end quote. I'm bridging now over to Bob Lazar. And
Well, let's don't bridge. Let's just stay with Gary first.
Okay, but let me just, because then you can segue, because I want to also bring up that X-Files episode in which they mention Element 115 ununpentium, which Bob Lazar
Yeah, I know about
claimed
that.
was
But let's
the
just do one
source
at
of
a time,
energy
because
in
we'll get-
1989, which then in late 2015 was added to the table of periodic elements. So either of those stories true? I mean, we're talking about not being able to find truth, and 60% of everything we see out there is a lie. Where do you stand on McKinnon? Where do you stand on Bob Lazar, Element 115?
All right, with respect to McKinnon, I believe that McKinnon saw exactly what he saw. I'm very high confidence that, in fact, he saw what he saw and he reported it as such. I believe that it did not prove anything. Well, nothing, no single thing proves anything. But it was still somewhat ambiguous. An extraterrestrial officer, that's very intriguing, without question. But he could mean something else. However, the fact that he came under as much pressure as he did makes me think that, in fact, he did find something which was an issue for them.
Right.
And it was a particular problem for them because you have to understand, our government is hacked day in and day out by extremely competent systems run out of North Korea, China, and elsewhere. I mean, hugely sophisticated. It's standard. It goes on all the time. And so, in that context, Gary McKinnon is absolutely nothing, except for one very important difference. North Korea may hack our computers day in and day out, but they're not calling up the New York Times and telling them what they found. When guys like Gary, young, just hackers, just doing their thing, go in and find a little something, they may very well tell people, like he did. And that's a problem for them. They're more worried about the Gary McKinnons, frankly, in some ways, with respect, certainly to the truth embargo, than they are with respect to the sophisticated national hacking. And so crushing Gary McKinnon would have been, well, first of all, it would have been a real problem for them. Huge public relations issues there. And so what they did was brilliant. They essentially put him under kind of, house arrest for 10 years and then dropped the whole thing, which I knew they would do, in order to send a message for all the other Gary McKinnons out there. Don't go there. So I have a sense he found something. And so I have good feeling about Gary, and I think he was telling the truth. Exactly what he found, one day we'll know in the post-disclosure world. Mm-hmm. Let's move to Bob Lazar. Bob Lazar's case is much more complicated than Gary McKinnon's. However, I have spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I've talked to people. I think the core story of Bob Lazar is true. One of the principal reasons I think that is because one of the people closest to Bob Lazar's story is a fellow by the name of George Knapp, investigative reporter for the KLAS in Las Vegas. George Knapp is an extremely sharp, high-end investigative journalist, no nonsense, and he's had great exposure to Bob Lazar. And George Knapp believes Bob Lazar's core story is true, and that's extremely positive in my view. Right. Now, does that mean the whole thing is true? No, not necessarily. And again, keeping in mind that we have a puzzle we're trying to solve that is missing pieces and has false pieces or incorrect pieces thrown in the box. The actual details we can't be certain about. Element 115? Who knows? I have a degree in physics. I'm not particularly enthusiastic about this idea that element is what's driving that propulsion systems or energy systems. However, it's interesting. It's also possible that he was handed that information. And it's false in order to test him or to put disinformation into the field.
True. But just to jump in quickly and say, it is very interesting that he made these claims in 1989, and in 2015, element 115 ununpentium was added to the table?
It's not that interesting to me.
Really?
There's a periodic chart, right? Elements go up based upon their weights, protons, neutrons, and so forth. And so the idea there could be a 115, any high school science student would figure that out. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that eventually 115 actually gets assigned doesn't surprise me, keeping in mind that in our physics, 115 only stays in existence for like microseconds.
Right.
Okay.
Right? Well, then it makes a good narrative for the X-Files TV show.
It makes a good narrative.
Right.
All right. And that's fine. But again, are there enough dots there to connect that actually allows us to say, yes, Bob Lazar's 115 part of his story must be true? No, there isn't. Or we don't have enough info, don't have enough dots. So you note it, you file it, right? You're aware of it, but do you get carried away with it? No. You can get carried away if you're Chris Carter. Right? And that brings us to a whole nother aspect of this. Just if it isn't difficult enough for you already, right? Since 1947, something else has happened, which really is unprecedented in human history. We evolved the most extensive, sophisticated entertainment systems in all of human history. Mm-hmm. We have created the ability to create films, movies, televisions, and so forth of extraordinary complexity and sophistication. And not only that, we've created the ability to put billions of eyes in front of this entertainment. This isn't the time of Shakespeare and a couple of hundred people stuffing himself in the Globe Theater to watch The Tempest. This is 100 million people sitting down and watching the Super Bowl.
Well, that's right. Well, let me ask you this, though, too, because now you really got me onto this idea of a Project Bluebeam type fake alien invasion, because we continue to see this messaging time and time again in the CIA, Mockingbird, mainstream media, in their media delivery vehicles like X-Files, which actually in that clip is mentioned the idea of a fake alien invasion.
What will seem like an attack on America by terrorists or Russia.
Or a simulated alien invasion using alien replica vehicles that exist and are already in use.
An alien invasion of the U.S.
The Russians tried it in 1947.
So getting back to this idea of off-planet terrestrial UFOs in a breakaway civilization. Oh, and I'll let you get back to it. But what do you make of the idea of a fake alien invasion? How many of the UFOs people see globally are of terrestrial origin versus off-planet origin?
It's a valid point. Yeah. It's something to consider. All right, but I want to make that other point first, and we'll move on to this.
Sure.
And that is, this vast entertainment complex has also grown up during this same period, which coincides with the ET, phenomena, mm-hmm. the rise of the secret empire, all right, and high intelligence operations, disinformation, and it's come along at the same time. So, whoa, why is that important? Well, there is an entertainment industry that makes billions of dollars by getting people to watch stuff, right? And I think that it's fair to say that, by and large, almost all of that is business. I make a movie, you watch it, I make money. But all of this entertainment is being written by people. At the core of it all are the scriptwriters, the teleplays, the screenplays, smart people. They write this stuff up. And where do they get the ideas? They get it from the world they live in. And so you got people that are living under the truth embargo at a time when the extraterrestrial phenomenon is going on, and there's a whole bunch of information about that, and they're digging into that and taking information and putting it into entertainment packages we then watch. And not surprisingly, they're reflecting. And they do it all the time. They reflect what's going on in the world. It is one of the chief ways that we viscerally get an understanding of what's happening. Hollywood shows it to us all the time. Now, does that mean that because Hollywood takes an idea and puts it up on a big screen in 3D, it make it true? No, it doesn't. Right? But is it true that they may be drawing off information that's in the world they live? Absolutely. Does that mean the information is true? Not at all.
Well, let me ask you this, though. Let me jump in. This is very important, and I'm absolutely tracking with you here. Catherine Bigelow, the former wife of James Cameron, did a movie a few years back called Zero Dark 30.
Correct.
And it's widely acknowledged that she was fed all sorts of classified information, talking points essentially, from the CIA. So as we need to watch and interpret this data that we're getting from the mainstream media, from the movies, from Hollywood, we don't often know where the information is coming from that these scriptwriters are pulling from.
Well, that's the other point I was going to add, that in addition to the fact that there's a vast entertainment industry that's drawing upon the information within our complex society to create stuff we're going to watch, there is the potential for interaction between that entertainment industry and government to, quote, influence what we watch. Now, Germany, of course, took that to a high degree. Right. They really ran with that idea. Soviets, too, but I think German probably did it even better. And that, of course, raises a whole nother problem for us consumers of information, right? When is something that we're watching in a movie simply the product of a screenwriter's imagination, drawing on what the screenwriter sees in this world, and what may be inserted by government in order to get us to think some way? Don't know. Though the very entertainment industry we're talking about has done plenty of movies about that subject. So what's true, what's not? Again, I'm getting back to that more fundamental. Partially by intention, because of the need for, in the minds of some, the creation of this vast national security empire I call the secret empire, and because of the simple realities of the access to information that we have and the complexities of our society. In other words, this isn't 100,000 years ago. We're not living 20 to a tribe in a cave somewhere with one fundamental goal, and that's to survive until nightfall. This is an unbelievably complex society. Given all of that, people have come to understand that it is next to impossible to know for sure what's true and what's not beyond the basics. Being able to know what is true and what is not is a major problem for people, and one of the reasons why the United States and other advanced cultures, but certainly the United States, are the greatest consumers of psychotropic drugs in history, right. and acids, I should add. We are so stressed because, unlike our ancestors, we have no idea from one day to the next what is true and what is not, and we know that knowing the difference it's critical to our well-being and survival. We are in a constant state of cognizant dissonance and paranoia, something that the government can then play on to a second level.
Right. And
so we have to take these drugs and coffee and caffeine and nicotine and everything else you can imagine to sort of cope with it all, and it's affecting our health. It is a mess. In other words, another way I like to put it is that for most of human history, which is roughly 300,000 years, the Homo sapiens sapien history, right? The last evolution of our current species, we were operating under Human Operating System 1.0. It's a basic operating system, gets the job done, got us through about 290-some thousand years. And then about 10,000 years ago, things started to change. And that operating system became increasingly less able to cope with the demands on it, just like a Commodore computer slowly having to deal with harder and harder software. At some point, it just doesn't work anymore. And we should have shifted over a long time ago, but we didn't. And so we carried Human Operating System 1.0 well into the 20th century. And that computer doesn't work. And so we're basically, our society is a computer that cannot run the software that it now must operate with, and therefore nothing much good is going to come from that.
Well, look,
and if you want to make each one of us a computer, our individual worldview, which we'll call Personal Operating System 1.0, is not upgrading fast enough. Well, we cannot cope.
Well, look, they're bombarding us with RF waves. I live in a neighborhood where brain cancer is absolutely off the chart. It's a statistical anomaly. It's called a cluster. It's very unusual.
All cancers are off the chart.
Yeah, well, we have literally, I'm saying this literally, on the house next to me on one side and the house next to me on the other side, each have a woman with a brain tumor. One just died a month ago. The other one is dying now. And these are young women, one in her 50s, one in her 40s. We are under absolute bombardment. And certainly the answer is not to embrace this transhumanist future, which this deep state, as I would call it, is moving us toward. But getting back to this idea in the time we have left of trying to find truth in this very, very complex minefield topic of the UFO question and disclosure. One thing that I think is true as it pertains to the mainstream mockingbird media, which is why SGT Report exists. It's the antidote to corporate propaganda, right? We know CNN does nothing but lie and spew government talking points all day. The same can be said of MSNBC, Fox News, so many, ABC TV, ABC News. The alt media is a tree that can bear fruit. So as it pertains to finding truth in the UFO disclosure question, I know there are researchers that you rely on and believe have good information. I think one of those people is Grant Cameron, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Daniel Sheehan, Richard Dolan, and another named Paul Hellyer. I want to ask you about Paul Hellyer. He said some very, very interesting things, and he was in a high position in Canadian government for a long time. What can you tell us about these researchers I've just mentioned, and how to discern truth based on the trees that you found who bear fruit?
Well, all the people you mentioned are good people, colleagues, and friends. Paul Hellyer is not a researcher in the ET field, not by a long shot.
But a
He is
whistleblower.
he is a researcher in the, I think, the area of government and finance, and he's written a number of books in that area. But he intersected with this issue back in 1995. I'm sorry, 2005, with the assistance of one of my colleagues, and he has spoken out. And he has been, I think, he's one of the witnesses. In other words, he is what we call a witness in the disclosure advocacy movement. Is a specific thing. It is a military agency political person of rank and station that is intersected with the issue and has something to say. And that's important. I mean, millions of people have had sightings. They're all witnesses to a degree, but you can't advance the advocacy movement that way. You need people like that. Captains of in the Army and the Air Force, astronauts, things like that. And he's a witness in that regard. And he's spoken out. Some of the things he said, I think, are off the mark because he doesn't have the knowledge base that some of the top researchers have. But he's trying to speak to it as best he can. And so he's a good man. Does that mean everything he said is true? No, not at all. But some of the things he said, I believe, are true and more than important enough to make him a witness, and I intend to put him in front of a congressional committee. Richard Dolan is the historian. He has done yeoman's work in trying to get at that history that I was talking about before, and he's written 2 books with a third on the way. I would say that Richard's work has a much lower percentage of incorrect information than you're going to find in most places. Grant Cameron is a researcher that's done yeoman work in terms of particularly the presidential connections, and that's of course his legacy. Presidentialufo.com. There's a lot of great material there. I think I have good confidence in a much higher percentage than in most places. He's now moved on into the consciousness work, and there are other people like that. There's a lot of people that have contributed to the truth process over these last 67 years. Hopefully they'll all get credit one day. But there's also even more people that have contributed to the confusion and to the opposite of truth.
Right.
Either by intention, or simply because they weren't competent enough, or simply because they were mistaken. Mm-hmm. And the scientific method was created to simplify and make that process more efficient, because every attempt to understand this cosmos that we live in has been a process of hit and miss, success and failure, confusion, hoaxes, and everything else. And that's why it took us 300,000 years to get from the trees to the moon. But the scientific process has speeded that up profoundly. And one of the reasons why we have this massive learning curve explosion. The scientific process was designed to create a method in which the nonsense, the falseness, the hoaxes, and everything else was stripped out fairly early, and the quality of information was advanced in an orderly process. And it's one of the most important inventions in all of human history. The political processes, of course, don't necessarily follow the scientific method, and in fact will deliberately disrupt it. The internet has come in and made it even tougher. And so one of the dilemmas of the truth advocacy movement on the ET question is that the embargo virtually cut out all of science. It eliminated the entire academic community. Not a single college, university has given proper instruction on this in the last 60 years. Several million professors have come and gone, and they won't even speak to it. Research institutions out of the question, right? So they've shut the science out. Only a few dare to go there, and a lot of them pay a price. And so the scientific method is being applied by what we'll call citizen sciences that don't have professional careers or the degrees, but they're doing the best they can. That kind of slows it down. It makes it vulnerable. I call it an intellectual ghetto. Governments do this. They ghettoize all the time. It's one of the most effective techniques that governments do to control people and ideas. You ghettoize them. How do you do it? You create a wall, you create a space, you put a wall around it, and you throw them in and allow them to slowly decay, cut off from the rest of society. In the case of people, you actually make physical walls. You wall them off, you stick them in a ghetto, you ridicule them, people look down on them, and you completely nullify them. But you can also create walls in the mind. The ridicule curtain is exactly that. It's a wall in the mind, used to wall off ideas to make them, quote, unacceptable to the mainstream and contain them. And that's exactly what they did with the ET question. They've done it with other things, and other societies have done similar things with other ideas. But the truth embargo is about intellectually ghettoizing the information and truth regarding the ET presence, and has been extremely effective. And that, of course, makes it even more difficult. And so, to double back on the essence of our discussion today is this. The number one thing, well, there are two things a person needs if they're going to make any progress in any issue and have some outcomes that are worth living for. One, they need to educate themselves about how to think, if they can. If they aren't already, they need to put some time into that. And two, they need to approach all of this with a profound sense of humility. I'm afraid humility is not in high dudgeon right now. People are leaping on every theory that comes along, this theory, that piece of information, grabbing it, making them their own, and then putting it back out is asserted fact. And that ain't helping at all.
Yeah, I agree.
And so misinformation piles on misinformation. I am hit with hundreds of theories every month, one way or another. They're coming at me through Facebook, through email, through interviews. Theory about 911, theory about the inner earth, theory about Nibiru, and on and on and on and on and on, right? And all I can say is, one, I try to be humble about it in the sense that everybody has their ideas, everybody has their thoughts on these things. You don't dismiss anything out of hand. On the other hand, you don't invest in anything out of hand. And so you have to have a sense of humility, particularly when you're going to put it back out. It's easy to just be generous and listen to people's ideas. It's harder to hold back going, oh, I like that. I like that one. You know, I'm really into that one. And boom, set up a website, put it out, and start making it gospel. Pick anything. Inoculations. Got a theory about inoculations. Absolutely certain that there's mercury and that's causing autism. Boom, there you go, and off you go. All right? It might be true. It might be false. Right? Not really sure. In fact, everything on that subject you'll find is fundamentally theoretical. Understanding the difference between theory and fact.
You hit a sore. Now I have to jump in. I have a child.
I could have picked.
No, I know you could have, but you hit one where it hits very close to home because I have a son with mild autism, and one of the things as we discuss these issues, as we can point to quantifiables within any subject, and one of the quantifiables that we now know is that Merck and their HPV vaccine is deadly and dangerous to young girls, and they knew it. The FDA approved it.
And
anyway.
nicotine,
and it continues
nicotine
to damage
is dangerous
girls.
to human beings, and the cigarette industry knew it.
No, that's absolutely right. And
we're being abused all the time.
It's fascism. It's the revolving door between corporate interests in the government, and it's absolutely killing our nation. And
Sure.
you know, as I said earlier on, the planet could be an Eden if it were in the hands of benevolent people who loved humanity. It's not, and that's the saddest part. And I absolutely agree with you about a lot of these theories that are being bandied about and people jumping onto. And humility is absolutely necessary in the approach to discussing these topics, because
We are literally drowning in a sea of theories right
that's
now.
absolutely right. And
Okay, I studied science in college.
but I just want to say about humility, not one of us can have all the answers. It's absolutely impossible for any
Not
one of us
can
to
even have
hold
a
all the
tiny
answers.
percentage of the answers.
Right. So humility is extremely important when having these conversations and examining these topics. And I know this particular topic will be a turnoff to some of our listeners because they think it's a turd in the punch bowl. Anytime you talk about UFOs, well, now you're diluting your conversation about criminal banking, your big pharma, fascism, right? You're diluting that conversation by talking about UFOs.
Well, you see, that's arrogance.
It is arrogance.
They're trying to make the point that their issue is superior to all other issues, and they're any time focused on somewhere else is diluting. That's arrogance. It's a mistake. It's not humility, and it will not serve them well.
Right. But that's why I always wanted...
understand that you can only deal so much. If someone is into 911 and they're putting, all their time and effort into trying to understand it, you're not going to be able to draw them into big discussions or even get them to invest in the advocacy on the ET issue. And that's fine. It's just like, if a guy's a brain surgeon, you can't go to him and say, look, give up on that for a couple of months. I want to teach you how to play bridge. No. So I get that. Again, humility, understanding that we have limits. There's only so much we can do. Don't demand that other people have to give over to your issue. Right. People will get involved in an ET issue that want to, right? And they're all welcome. Activism is about getting an outcome. It's not about converting people to an ideology. Activism is about acting, right? And that's a good thing, because action is a lot simpler, right? Believe me, trying to get a government to say pass a Civil Rights Act is ultimately a hell of a lot easier than trying to convince, 10,000 people to convert to Buddhism, all right? Action that gives results. That's the world I like to live in, right? Action that gives results. Not that I can talk theory with anybody. I can talk philosophy as well. But ultimately, action is what affects our immediate lives. And therefore, what we need is a reformist movement in America. And we need activism to become elevated to be like a profession that's highly desirable. And we need more and more people becoming activists. The number of people that are activists in our communities right now, or in general, is way below what we need to be effective, just like our savings rate is way too low to be effective. Mm-hmm. And these are macroscopic changes that are going to have to take place. I really enjoyed this discussion. And one of the reasons I enjoyed it is because rather than beat a particular horse that's probably either dead or near dead and getting nowhere, we've talked about some larger perspectives in a very intellectual way that I think are very useful to more people, right? Whether your issue is the Fed or Big Pharma or environmental destruction and abuse or GMOs or pick it. There's 1,000 things out there now. Most of the things we talked about apply to all of them. Dilution of information, whether it's lies from corporations. The corporations were able to string out the cigarette thing for decades based upon outright lies, but eventually had to pay up billions of dollars, and a significant amount of truth emerged. But it took decades. Just like it took decades for the automobile corporations to actually understand that flying through a windshield upon a collision was probably not a good thing. All right? And that's because corporations are not people. They're organizations, and they're fundamentally amoral. These things we know, right? And we're starting to get a handle on that. But ultimately, hey, we live in a highly complex society that has a whole broad range of very negative things that can happen on any given day. It can get better. We can do better than we are doing now, without question. And I believe, and this is a very broad perspective, that the number one thing that will make things better without solving every issue one by one is to find ways to elevate the percentage of truth that is operating within the social contract. And there are things that can be done there, and they transcend issues. They are matters of process. Nobody knows all the truths. Telling the truth, or at least trying to tell the truth, is, whether you're a government or whether a person, going to give you better outcomes. Does that mean you won't get cancer? Does it mean you won't get blown up by a terrorist bomb? Absolutely not. It just means that your prospects are better, and in some cases superior. Right? It can be the difference in living 20 years or 100 years. It can be different with a nation lasting 200 years or just 50 years. Right. The Soviet Union lasted 73. A lot of the nations that were in the Middle East, some of them never made 15 or 20 years. Right? So these are macroscopic issues of great importance. I try to keep those in mind. Now my job is not to go preach that sermon. We're having this discussion, but I can tell you I've had maybe 2 of these in the last 10 years. But you're the kind of person you can have this with. You got the kind of intellect in the audience to have this in front of.
Well,
right?
Thank you.
But ultimately, I try to always be coming from this more macroscopic sense of things. I have selected as my mission in life getting one fundamental thing done. That is very simple. Right? The President of the United States tells a basic truth about our world. Something so simple and straightforward that you don't have to even have a high school education to get. There's either extraterrestrials here or there aren't. And if there are, the government needs to acknowledge that. And that is the disclosure event. That is the goal of this movement. Now, what comes after that? There are several 100 million possibilities. And all I can say is that the one thing I can say about the post-disclosure world is that it will start from a profound and absolute certain truth. And that's a good thing, right? A wonderful analogy is Christianity. Christianity springs from a single event, basically, the life of an individual. But what we know about that life and what was even known beyond a small circle about that life is very, very limited and may be very off the mark. There may be a lot of falseness there, but it was an event. And for some people, it was a truth. And from that developed an entire religion, which has had its good and had its bad. But you can see that it had a profound effect. The disclosure event will have more absolute truth associated with it, known to more people, and have more impact by magnitudes than the Christ event, which took almost 1,000 years before it even got, going.
Well, and we don't have to talk about this because we don't have time. But what you just said is very, very important because there is a contingent, there is a group, there's a population that studies this subject that is very, very concerned about an alien deception, Project Bluebeam, about
Project
this
Blue, yeah.
deep state using this technology, hidden technology, deep state technology against humanity for the purposes of an alien deception.
And
We
I'll
can talk
speak to
about
that.
that or not, but what I really
No,
did...
I'll speak to that. Let me speak
okay,
to that.
well, and
because it
okay,
comes
go
up
ahead,
a
and then
lot.
I have to ask you about NASA. I have to.
Okay.
Go ahead.
The Project Bluebeam is basically a name that has been attached to represent an ET false flag. The reason that's important is because governments do false flags all the time. It's a Machiavellian technique, just like the intellectual ghettoization concept. Mm-hmm. These are highly effective ways to manipulate people, and they work, and they've been done. Now, it's also the case that, in the modern world, we know this pretty well. We know this history of these things. We're not ignorant. So, we're not. That's a good thing. Right? So, yeah, it's a false flag. Could it happen? Theoretically, it could happen. Am I that concerned about it? No. And there's a reason. A fault, because the government very likely, I have a high confidence that the government does have anti-gravitic craft developed from reverse engineered technology. And once you've got that, the idea of staging some kind of a false flag would be pretty easy. You just fly a couple anti-gravitic craft over a city, blow some things up, boom, blame the ETs. It would be kind of easy. Some people are not satisfied with that, and they get into holographic representations in the sky and all this stuff. Basically, let's just keep it simple. All right? They could do that. I don't think they will. And there's reasons, and good reasons. One of the reasons they won't do that is the internet and the nature of information today. More people know more stuff about this issue than probably any issue you can point to. Now, a lot of what they know is not true, but do they know a lot? Yeah. Are they paying attention? Oh, God, yes. The UFO issue, which I refer to as the extraterrestrial presence issue, is the largest genre of FOIA requests in history. It is always in the top 2 or 3 Googled genres, search genres on the internet. It has virtually 100% market penetration. And it is profound beyond measure. All right, there are a lot of issues out there people are paying attention to. They just aren't that profound. Given all of that, when the disclosure event takes place, the number of eyeballs that are going to be focused on it is going to be in the billions. Yeah. Billions of eyeballs looking at it. And almost all of those eyeballs are going to have a computer with access to the internet. And so if the government tries to screw with the truth on this, if they try to use it as an opportunity, like some believe happened with 911, a sort of just take advantage of it, right? We didn't cause it, but hey, no reason we can't take advantage of that.
Well, some would argue that the deep state did cause it, with World Trade Center 7 being the smoking gun, and BBC reporting early on the collapse of World Trade Center 7, but I digress. Go ahead.
So to take advantage of the fact, we got to disclose, we're going to have to tell them about ETs, but let's just use that, right? Let's create a false flag. It'll, create a massive need for billions of new expenditures for defense, and we'll create a space weapons command and blah, blah, blah. And, all the government contractors will make gazillions of dollars and we'll all die rich, which we already were anyway. They could do that, but with billions of eyes focused on them in an intensity unseen in history, with the ability to go online. Not everybody can do this, but many would, and parse everything that happens, every word that they say, every word that they write.
They couldn't get away with it, is what you're saying.
I don't think they can get away with it.
Yeah.
And it will blow up in their face and be a catastrophe.
Yeah.
The kind of thing that could bring down whole governments. It's too risky. And there's another reason why they can't do it. You see, they have their little Machiavellian games, and they screw with us, and they get away with it. But we're not the ETs. The ETs can do any damn thing they want. And so playing with the ET issue, knowing that the ETs can do what they want, makes it doubly risky. In other words, they would have pretty much exceeded their Peter principle there. They would have gone too far. And I think there's enough people inside our government to realize, no, not this time. So am I worried about a blue beam? No, I'm not. Would I be just shocked if it happened? No. I would be deeply disappointed and probably looking for a comfortable place to live on a beach somewhere in Australia.
Well, you could help us blow the whistle on it. And I mean, that's obviously what you're saying.
Believe me, I'll be in the front line. I won't be alone. I'll be part of millions and millions of people that'll be looking at this going, what?
Right.
All right. So again, but that's why it gets us down to something we were saying earlier. Look, the fact that is a potential theory is meaningful, and the fact that people are thinking about that is meaningful, right? But then you'll have somebody that'll come forward and say, oh, yeah, there is a blue beam. I know all about it. I know when it's going to happen. I know the people involved, but I can't tell you their names. You see the difference there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so when someone goes that direction, you got to step back and go, wait a minute now. Okay, I like the idea. It's a theory, needs consideration, but you're making assertions I don't think you can back up. So I'm not going to travel that road too far with you. And that's wouldn't be a big deal, except there's 1,000 roads like that, and they're constantly being put in front of us saying, come down this road with us. Go here, go there, believe this, believe that. Right? And since September 2011, I don't know how many theories that have been put in front of me on that issue. And every one of them believed it's absolutely the theory, the explanation. And when you tell them that all of them can't be true, that doesn't really affect them much. Well, they all can't be true. Mine's true. This theory's true. Go here.
Well, look, I want to address one thing real quickly and mention the term I mentioned a million times before on SGT Report. There's a term called astroturf, and it is the active implementation of disinformation by the powers that be into these different segments, be it the UFO research segment, be it the issue of false flag terror, 7/7 bombings, 9/11. AstroTurf, there's actively paid opponents to truth that are out there every single day trying to put a turd in the punch bowl and ruin the entire movement. And as it pertains to 9/11, the one thing I can say, because we don't have time to get off on that topic, is that the official story is the most lunatic story of all, because it does not hold water. It literally won't hold water. It will not hold water. So
there's evidence of disinformation in virtually all of the controversial issues of our time.
Well, including
Kennedy assassination.
That's absolutely right. But
you see that.
But before we lose you, I have to ask you about NASA. We don't have to talk about the moon landings. We don't have time. But I wanted to ask you about NASA. Can we believe a word they say about anything when they tell us that 1,400 reels of telemetry data is missing from the moon landings? When they tell us they've lost hundreds of their moon rocks? When they tell us, nothing adds up with NASA. And, they seem to have a propensity for covering up the truth. We see the STS-75 tether incident, which I think is very gripping. Shuttle Columbia and the tether incident, and what appear to be giant orbs, objects moving behind the tether as the tether is, 40, 50, 60 miles away from the shuttle. And NASA tells us that those are ice crystals. NASA won't address any of the anomalies that have been photographed on Mars, right? They continue to engage in half-truths or outright lies. And so before we let you go, I just had to get your perspective on NASA. Can we believe a word that ever comes from NASA?
Well, you cannot take verbatim anything that comes from NASA that has implications on the ET issue. That's without question. There's plenty of things that NASA says that are quite true, though it would be helpful if you had significant scientific background and you'd be going, oh yeah, and there are plenty of people that follow NASA very closely, and NASA does and says a lot of things which are quite valid, and people enjoy that. However, here's what people need to know about NASA. NASA is one of the biggest victims of the ET truth embargo. So it is caught between a rock and a hard place, and has been from the day it was born. And I have empathy for it, a lot of empathy for it. Awful lot of good people have gone and worked there and done some extraordinary things. They didn't create the situation that NASA's in. History just delivered it up. Now, what am I talking about? Again, it helps to have historical perspective here. NASA was born in 1958. It had to be created because we had to have a space program, and it couldn't just be secret. We were competing with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was in space. People knew that. What was the United States going to do? Have a secret program? And people would say, well, do you have a satellite in? Can't tell you. So we had to have a space program. We knew we were going to have a military space program, but we had to have a public space program and go to the moon. All right, fine. So we created NASA in 1958. But when it was created by the Space Act, those of you, anybody who goes and reads that act will find that in the very first page, there is an extremely important caveat, and that is that while NASA is a civilian agency, anything that might have to do with national security would in fact come under the aegis of the Pentagon. A Space Council was set up, of which the president was the head, and one of its chief responsibilities was mediating disputes between NASA and the Pentagon over what was national security and what wasn't. Fine. Eventually they did away with that, so there was no mediator at all. Now, why did they do that? It's very simple. It was 1958. It was 11 years after Roswell. So at the point that NASA was created, there were plenty of people, not only in the White House, but at Pentagon, that were fully aware of an extraterrestrial presence, and obviously knew that if you're going to create a space agency and it's going to go flying around the solar system, there was a potential for it to encounter that presence. And that could not be acknowledged. It could not be public because of the truth embargo. Truth embargo had isolated the issue. And so NASA was going to have to operate, but it could not engage the ET issue in any way whatsoever. All of that would go to the Pentagon. That was from day one. At the same time that NASA was created, they also launched the initial SETI program, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. That was set up basically as a diversion program. It was a beard, meaning that the SETI program needed to be set up because even by 58, there was a huge amount of public interest in this phenomena, which has been seen all over the world. And if the government didn't show a legitimate interest in that, that would look pretty suspicious. And so why not create a program that's going to look for extraterrestrials? There could be life out there. We're going to look for their signals, knowing full well that they weren't going to find any. If they did, they weren't going to tell anybody. But just having the SETI program took some pressure off the government. So SETI was set up to take some pressure off the government. NASA was set up to have a public space program, but the ET issue was never going to be a factor. And everything that's been done since has had to be done in that environment. So I can't imagine anybody working for NASA at a reasonable level doesn't have ulcers. They must have antacid dispensers in virtually every office.
Right.
Because these are smart people, and they can read Stanton Friedman just as easily as you or I can. And the evidence, which has been amassed in the public sector, was rather huge. And so even with a little effort, they could have figured out on their own, my God, there is an ET presence, but I can't talk about it,
Well-
and we're not going to engage it.
Well, absolutely,
And-
but I just want to back you up on one thing, too, because you're calling NASA the public-facing space program, which is absolutely 100% on point, because we know since they've dismantled the shuttle program, we see the top-secret X-37B military space plane orbit around the planet, according to the Air Force, for a year, and everything that they're doing is top-secret, classified. We don't know anything about it. So we
Well, there's
saw
always been a classified space program, and we're getting some evidence of that now because increasingly we have the ability to learn about this
Well,
stuff.
that's right. But again, it speaks to the breakaway civilization or the deep state benefiting from technology that they will not share with humanity. And I find it fascinating that NASA's public-facing shuttle program gets shuttered and shut down, and yet we're still exploring space with the top-secret X-37B. We're just not privy to anything it finds, any information they get. It's all for the deep state. It's all for the breakaway civilization. You and I will disagree
again,
on that
you're
term.
saying that.
We'll disagree
I
on
don't
that
believe
term.
breakaway civilization.
No, I know. We'll disagree on that term. We can call it the deep state, which Peter Dale Scott coined.
Call it the secret empire.
The secret empire, but
our
again,
secret national security structures.
Absolutely. Peter
It's
Dale
just like,
Scott would call
you
it
can't
the
get access to nuclear.
Well, that's right.
But
Peter Dale Scott would call it the deep state, which I think is a terrific term because it's the deep state behind the public-facing government, just like the Air Force top-secret X-37B is the military space plane behind the public-facing NASA program. So,
it's not behind. It's
it's hidden. It's certainly hidden from most of the sheeple. Most of the
hidden
people.
is not the same as behind. In other words, it's not like the U.S.
Well,
Congress
hidden. When I
knows
say
all
behind,
about.
I mean hidden. It's hidden. It's top secret.
All right,
It's
well, there's a difference.
classified. So
No,
anyway, but
it's not that the Congress knows about these things, but don't speak about it, and the stuff operates behind the Congress. The Congress is out of the picture completely.
well, that's exactly
They have no
right.
access to it.
Well, it's classified.
So that's not a sign. That's aside from, and that's
No.
a very significant distinction.
No, but I
Right? It's
agree
one
with you.
thing
But
for
see,
the president to know all about this and say nothing. It's another thing for the president not to even have access to
that's
it.
right. And there's where we're in agreement on this quote empire, right? This deep state. There is a very, very tiny piece of humanity that is benefiting from technologies and information that it is not sharing with the rest of us.
Oh yeah, that's a given.
And it's very, very dangerous. It's extremely
of course it is.
dangerous. You know, which gets us
now-
back to the Denver airport and all the stuff going on there, which you covered in your presentation. I find it very fascinating. I mean, they've already set up their secondary Washington, D.C., should they ever get us into a nuclear
I
exchange.
believe that they have. It is a theory of which I have some confidence in. I can't say with absolute certainty.
Absolutely, I agree, but I think you're on the right track.
But let me give you some good news.
Well, okay, but let me ask you this. Before you give me the good news, what did you make of the STS-75 tether incident in those objects?
There are a number of
Do you believe they were ice crystals?
NASA videos which are very interesting, which I consider anomalous. The tether is just one of those. Exactly what's going on there, not sure. I don't like the ice crystal theory. By and large, it's the default position, and of course, it's the heart and soul of James Oberg's life's mission, which is to ice crystallize virtually everything regarding anomalies in NASA, and I get that. The most interesting about, I think, the ice crystals there, and again, we're getting into the minutiae detail stuff, is that many of the basically circular objects had a wedge out of them.
Yep.
And no one has ever come forward and explained how ice crystals, or why they would develop that wedge. And I'm interested in that. So there may be something there. But there are several other videos I think that are even more important than that one that have significant implications.
Can you shout out a few of those? Because I think the audience would be very...
I can't give you the names. One of the most important is when you see an object that is coming in from deep space, and then it reverse directions, and right after that there's a what could be a meteorite, but a rather conveniently placed one. And people can go find all these things. They're all over the place. But it's even getting better than that now. You have during the era of the truth embargo, NASA has been operating and taking millions of photographs at a volume and a level that they can't possibly screen them all, but then they're not really generally available. However, to some degree, a lot of them are available. And as we've gone forward, something is happening which couldn't even conceivably have happened 20 years ago. You've got people all over the world that are grabbing these photographs, Mars, Moon, and elsewhere, pulling them off the archives and going over them with fine-tooth combs, with magnifying glass, breaking them down with image software manipulation, and they're finding anomalies all over the place. And there's almost no way they can stop it, right? Because I guess when they were archiving this stuff years ago, and it became so huge, the idea they can somehow go back and clean it all up now that 9-year-olds have software more powerful than humans even thought possible in 1965, it's just not possible. And so again, the truth embargo is literally leaking. It's like a boat. It's now got 50 leaks in the bottom, and it's only a matter of time before it sinks. Which brings me to my good news. Can you give me your best just theory as to why the space shuttle program was shut down?
My best theory?
Hmm?
Well, I think it's a little bit like the social programs. You talk about the social contract, which now this government is really in the process of breaking because of the $19 trillion in debt in which we find ourselves. I think the social contract, and again, I'm going to refer to it as the deep state, this breakaway state of controllers, don't want humanity to go along for the ride. And so to shutter down the public-facing space program is to admit that we've seen all we can see, we've done all we can do, and you people should just go back to sleep. Meanwhile, they're busy at work exploring space and gaining knowledge that they're not going to share with the rest of us.
There's still a space program, but they stopped the shuttles.
Well, that's true. Why do you think they
Well,
shuttered
you gave
it?
an interesting theory. You suffer from an affliction that everyone with high IQs suffers from, and that is that it's easy to come up with incredibly complex explanations for almost anything. I mean, that kind of thinking obviously also brings a lot of good stuff. And the problem is that frequently when you go that direction, you miss the obvious, you miss the simple. Because oftentimes, remember Occam's razor, simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Here is my theory for why the space shuttle program was shut down. First of all, the entire advocacy movement to bring about disclosure is completely public operation. It isn't being run like some anonymous program hidden in a bunker somewhere and nobody knows what's going on. It's all out in the open. They know what we're doing all the time. They know the information we have, documents we have. They know the media connections we have and everything else. They're following it all. So they're watching the disclosure advocacy movement move forward in time, and they're also fully aware of the leaks in the disclosure boat, or the truth embargo's boat. They know all about this, right? In other words, just like many people, but certainly not enough, were aware of the impending demise of the Soviet Union. Not everybody was, but there were some that did. They knew its time was almost over. They are aware the truth embargo's days are numbered, and they have for some time. Now, the end of the truth embargo is disclosure. And disclosure has consequences for government agencies and people. How that'll go depends upon what the public wants, but it's going to be a major public relations problem for many entities. Whether you're CIA or Air Force, Congress, the President, NASA, it's going to be major public relations problems. So NASA is in a really tough spot, and it has been all along. And here's the problem. When disclosure takes place, NASA's dilemma will become public knowledge pretty quickly. The fact that it had to operate and not be able to deal with the ET issue, that it had to avoid and turn over all this to the Pentagon, and it was confined and limited and hamstrung, will become public. I think people will be very sympathetic. But NASA isn't the only one affected. And so if you are the government and you know the truth embargo is coming to an end pretty soon, and you know that shortly after that announcement, questions are going to be raised very quickly about what kind of technology have you got in the secret program? What have you garnished from crashed vehicles? Have you successfully re-engineered anti-gravitic propulsion? Do you have anti-gravitic propulsion craft? And once those questions are asked, if they give the truth, meaning, yeah, we've got them, and we've had them since 1960, the next question is, well, how is it that we've been spending all this money and risking the lives of all these astronauts, sending them up on chemical rockets when you had much easier ways to go into orbit? 14 people died, you may recall. That's a problem.
Yeah.
And it won't be an easy one, but they will do their best. But one thing's for sure. And then when you factor in, and let me add one more factor, when you factor in the fact that less, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are CIA operatives, either one of those world leaders could announce the ET presence at any time. They could come out, make the announcement, provide lots of evidence, and that would be the ballgame.
Oh, well, now that's very interesting, though. You think Vladimir Putin is a CIA operative?
No. I say unless he is.
Unless he is. Okay,
and he
good.
Ain't. He ain't.
Okay,
So
I don't believe he is either, because he's
No, of
saying
course not.
some things that the powers that be in this country do not want him to say, and he's disclosing things they don't want disclosed,
Sure.
and he stands in opposition to this Kissinger New World Order, as far as I can tell.
Okay, so the point I'm making is that if you know the truth embargo could end at any time, and you know the questions are going to be asked, you do not want to have an active shuttle program actually still underway. You don't want to be still sending people up on those, Rube Goldbergian chemical rocket-driven, shuttles,
Yeah.
right?
1960s technology.
At the same time that the announcement is made and the obvious question. So you need to get that program shut down. And I believe that the shuttle program was put to bed, even though many people didn't want that, and even though we were going to have to suffer the indignation of using Russian rockets to essentially provide the support to our people at the space station. It was far better than having that program still active when disclosure took place. And in fact, there's a lot of things going on right now that come under the basic heading of what I call positioning, in which entities, agencies, people, organizations, Catholic Church, NASA, Pentagon, CIA, which just released a bunch of files, are doing what they can to mitigate the public relations problems they are going to face when disclosure happens. And the reason you're seeing those maneuvers is because disclosure is about to happen.
Powerful. Guys, our guest has been Stephen Basset. He's the executive director of Paradigm Research Group, and obviously somebody who's definitely focused on finding the truth. Mr. Basset, I can't thank you enough for your time. Can you direct people to your websites and any action they could take if they want to participate in your activism in trying to get disclosure to happen sooner than later?
Right now I have paradigmresearchgroup.org set up to take people to two fundamental places. The main graphic link will take you to the Rockefeller Initiative documents, and the link at the bottom of that page, paradigmresearchgroup.org, will take you to the Congressional Hearing Political Initiative. There you will find a huge amount of material, particularly media coverage, of the political developments that have been going on relative to this issue since November of 2014. And if you were to spend your time on that page long enough, you'd start to understand what I know, is that the truth embargo is in fact approaching its end, that the catalyst for that will probably be Secretary Clinton and her husband's connection to the issue going back to 93 to 96. That will then trigger a media frenzy, which will then be a catalyst to the president and the Pentagon to cut a deal so the disclosure can take place before the whole thing blows up in their face. That's what's going on. Right now, I have 11 journalists who have written about this subject and have the green light to keep writing about this subject. And I expect that group to grow. More articles are on their way. All of this is at these. You can see this at the key page, which is paradigmresearchgroup.org. You can then link into the deeper into the site, and there's a whole bunch of stuff there. But that's the two things: the Rockefeller Initiative documents and the Congressional Hearing Political Initiative, and all the media coverage, hundreds and hundreds of articles about the political connection, which have never really had happened before. That is where people start to realize the jig is almost up, and to prepare for that event. And it's just an event. It's a simple truth. Yes, there's an ET presence. Behind that is a million other truths. And whether or not we get a lot of those, or just a few of them, or whether we get a lot of bullshit, is going to be pretty much dependent upon the people. One, they need to commit themselves to hold the government's feet to the fire. They need to educate themselves as quickly as possible. They need to pay attention. They need to keep an open mind. In the meantime, one of the things they can do, which is again another interesting aspect of our new, media world, is that anytime they come across some of these articles on the net that address this issue, and they've got comment sections, which is still pretty much the case at about 50%, though some of them are cutting it down, but they'll bring them back. If this article is on mark, on target, tell them so. Praise the reporter, praise the venue, and tell them you want to hear more. If it's full of crap, then point it out and say, look, this is nonsense. You don't know what you're talking about. Use the comment sections to reflect your thinking on this and to put a little pressure on the media to keep going. I assure you, all of those comments are read by not only the reporter, but also followed by the editors. They really pay attention. As bad as some of those comments are, and they can be awful, they're paying attention. They are, in fact, a way to connect to the media, as opposed to, quote, writing that letter to the paper. Back in 1964, they had a 1 in 50 chance of you making it in, and then they'd edit it down to one paragraph. Now you can comment all day long. Some of these comment sections you can put in 20 paragraphs. Use those comment sections to express your views that you want the truth of this, and when you see what really looks like the truth, let them know you're very happy about that. So that's one thing people can do right now.
Well, it's hard to know how to wrap this up because, I want you to know that this is the longest interview I've ever done in probably more than 400 interviews. It's a topic that deserves the time because certainly we've just scratched the surface. And guys, I hope you've enjoyed, for those of you who are still with us, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. Clearly, it was far-reaching, and again, we just scratched the surface. If you want to learn more, please do visit paradigmresearchgroup.org. Check out the work of Stephen Basset. Stephen, I've really enjoyed this conversation with you, and I really thank you for your time.
Very good conversation, Sean. SGT report is on my email list. You're getting the updates. You see something profound come from my direction, bring me back on. We'll talk about it.
Oh, absolutely. I look forward to it. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. Again, those of you who have stuck with us for over an hour and a half, we're really appreciative of you taking the time, opening your mind to these big topics, because again, not any one of us can have all of the answers. It's impossible. What we're trying to do is discern truth and talk to the people who have trees that bear fruit. So thanks so much for your support at sgtreport.com, thelibertymill.com, and thephaser.com, where we try to provide for you real news, honest news, truthful news, 24/7. God bless. Have a great week.